The people that are impacted most by the challenges we're talking about must be part of, and want to be part of, and should be part of creating the solutions and creating the responses. It's not a consultation process, but it actually saying, how do we genuinely create structures of power, and how do we genuinely share relationships of power with people that are impacted by these challenges so that they actually can help design responses to them. If you genuinely gave the resources to 5,000 rural farmers in India and said, innovate and crack these problems, it's like, what would happen basically? That's the risk aversion that we actually need to deal with, which is actually maybe just say yes and see what happens, and try it out and actually have some faith in people. But it requires letting go of the status quo. It requires letting go of existing structures of privilege and business as usual and so on. And it's like, if we're not going to let go of those things, then we cannot do these things.
Hello, welcome back to the show. One of you wrote in recently and shared, "I'm so glad to have found this. Listening to positive and mature conversations about the future in this turbulent time makes me feel less alone." I was reading recently that the definition of loneliness is not having people that you can have meaningful conversations with. We are honored and humbled to be offering this space for you. And we love to connect with you and get to know you through our two communities, where you can find others to have these conversations with, as well as sharing the inspiration that has moved you through what you've heard on the podcast. Thank you to our newest patrons who have asked to be anonymous. We deeply appreciate you. If you love this show and are ready to support us, connect with our community, and want this to continue and to flourish, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community. You can be a patron with anything from just $2 a month to however much you feel is right, given the value that you receive from these conversations. What we're doing here is creating a new and radical kind of media where we're able to give a voice to those that don't often get a voice, or take the conversation into deeper places than usually we get to explore. And so we really feel that this value of this kind of media is so important in the times that we live in. You may now know about Presence Collective, our online membership for creative, connected, and courageous living. We focus here more on the integration piece. How do we embody the values and wisdom shared in this podcast? What practices do we need? This month, we're focused on transforming eco-anxiety into eco-grief, and then into the activism the earth is calling for. How do you use your privilege and position to contribute to the protection of the earth? If you want to join Presence Collective, simply visit our website and click on courses. We would love for you to be part of this. I have a couple of requests for contributions for the show. One is for a graphic designer or artist that can donate some time and energy to redo our logo and the podcast artwork so that we can refreshen. When we launch, we use the artwork from our book cover for ease, but it feels like time for something that fits what we've created over these 70 episodes. And the other thing is that we would love to be featured in the press and magazines so more people can find us. If you have any PR skills or contacts with any media who you feel would be interested in what we're doing, please do write to us on connect@thefutureisbeautiful so that we can widen this community and connect with more people that want to hear from our guests. This week's conversation is a very powerful one. I sit down with Zaid Hassan, a strategist, writer, and facilitator. He has 20 years of experience working on complex social challenges such as agriculture, climate change, education, energy, financial systems, malnutrition, public health care, racism, security, sustainable development, unemployment, and youth issues. Zaid has frequently worked on issues relating to the Muslim community. He's worked with a diverse range of clients, including various governments, organizations like the World Bank and the UN, a number of foundations, and philanthropists. Zaid has worked all over the world in countries ranging from the US to Zimbabwe. Prior to 10 in 10, Zaid was CEO of Roller Strategies, a professional services firm focused on next-gen solutions to the world's most complex challenges. Zaid is the author of The Social Labs Revolution, a new approach to solving our most complex challenges. Each of the organizations Zaid has worked for and founded has served as a vehicle for evolving the practice of tackling complex challenges. He has spent 20 years building this approach. Zaid and I have been in similar circles, we realized, for well over a decade, but not met until we recorded this. We have a powerful conversation about his new project, 10 in 10, which is exploring with action how we can work together to tackle 10 global challenges in 10 years. The approach includes embracing complexity and also actually including the people most affected by these challenges in the way forward. The 10 global challenges include climate change, water, agriculture and food, gender inequality, youth unemployment, social housing, mental health, early years, as in children under 5, structural racism, and artificial intelligence. This weave of these 10 challenges shows the need for us to move beyond silos so that we can understand how each issue and challenge affects the other. We talked a lot about the dominant systems where power, privilege, and narrow thinking holds us back, and how to open ourselves to trusting in people and not knowing the way forward exactly. And this conversation reminds me that the future is wide open. We explore the question, how can we radically shift our approach to working with complex challenges? I hope that you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. Zaid, it's a great pleasure to welcome you onto the show. I have been told by several people to interview you actually since this show began. And so it feels good that it's happening right now.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm glad it worked out.
So recently you have set up a new organization, 10 in 10. And I feel like this has come with some fervor. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about what that is and why you felt the need to step into that and to close down some of the other things that you were working on.
Yeah. I think fervor is the right word. And so I guess there's a little bit of a backstory. And the backstory is that I've been doing this sort of work for almost 20 years now. And I remember being the youngest person in the room. And now often I'm kind of the oldest person in the room. And so I can kind of see that journey in my mind. Yeah, so I think when I started this work, my assumption was that I was going to learn from people how to do it, and then I'm going to know how to do it. Particularly for the first 10 years, you know, I kind of think of myself as quite a slow learner in some ways. It takes me time to kind of realize, if you like, things. So I feel like for the first 10 years, I kind of walked around the world giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, where I was like, you know, I will believe when people profess to know how to do things because they're saying it, you know, so I believe it. And it took me kind of quite a while to realize that all was not as it seems. And not that, you know, people aren't honest or people aren't being, you know, frank, if you like, about their work. But what I realized is that, you know, the state of the field, so to speak, is quite immature. Do we know how to work with complexity? What does it mean to be effective? Do we understand complexity? What I realized is that the entire field is new and it's immature, and actually there's a long, long, long way to go. But the way kind of markets work and the way consulting works and the way marketing works and capitalism works is that you profess to know how to do things and you sell that. And that's kind of a weird It's kind of weird in a way. It's like we're in an immature field. So rather than acknowledging broadly that, we all have a long way to go, you say you know how to do things, and we don't, And it's not that there aren't things we know. There are things we know, and there are things we also don't know. But it's a bit like you're not very transparent and clear about the things that really you don't know how to do. It almost reminds me of, any scientific experiment that discovers something. It would be quite odd for the scientist to say, I know. It would be quite odd for the person who discovered penicillin to say, I knew what I was doing. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and it was replicable, and it was scalable, and, all of this language that we use. And it's like, it's kind of a bizarre point in history in some ways that we profess to something that we don't really, it's, do you know what I mean?
Totally. It reminds me of actually a kind of pinnacle kind of moment in my own career of working with my own issues of kind of self-worth and imposter syndrome, and kind of being in these rooms, often quite male dominated, often people older and smarter than me, and kind of trying to articulate something or find my way. And then various people that I admire started to just sort of pull me aside and say, I have no idea what I'm doing, just so you know.
Right.
We're all making it up.
Right.
And one moment in particular was working with somebody on a political campaign who had worked for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister, and had said that I was about to go and do a media piece for this campaign, and the person said, Tony Blair was always sweating before he went on TV. This idea that you get to a place where is not actually true. Like you can be the Prime Minister and you can be on TV every day, and still it's like, don't know why I just outed Tony Blair. We haven't heard his name for a while.
Yeah, we haven't. Yeah.
Maybe it's time.
Yeah.
And for me, that was this kind of moment of like, oh, okay, everyone's pretending.
Yeah, right.
Which seemed really comforting 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But now it's quite shockingly scary, actually.
Yeah, completely. And I also think that, the problem with that is that you then can't make distinctions about the things you do know and the things you don't know. And in fact, there might be certain things that we know how to do. We were talking about yoga earlier. It's like, it's been around a while. There are certain things we know about good posture and so on. And there's certain things we don't know about ourselves, for example. So I kind of feel that, a more honest appraisal of these are the things we don't know, and these are the things that we have some idea about or we have some experience with, would help, I think, in our current situation. And I feel that it's almost preventing the maturity and the maturing of the work and the practice and the field. And what I realized, I guess, to come to your question about kind of 10 in 10, was that I've worked primarily in a consulting model, mainly because that's what I ended up doing. But what I realized is that those distinctions are very difficult to find in a consulting model. So, your clients do not hire you for you to tell them, I don't know, and you don't know either, and we need to discover this together. And it's like, no, that's not why we're hiring you. So part of the challenge I kind of feel is, how do we have a more honest appraisal about what it is we do know and what it is we don't know, because we're on a timetable now. And it's a bit like that timetable does not afford us the luxury of pretending anymore. If we want to mature our practice, we have to be honest about the state of our practice and mature that practice together. And so that was partly for me the impetus, which is that, we cannot go around pretending that we are in a mature field and we know how to address complex challenges or tackle them, because as a society, we largely don't. And more so, I would kind of say, I've started making this distinction between practice and malpractice. I think there's practice and there's malpractice. And malpractice is a lot easier than practice, basically, because for malpractice, there are no distinctions. You just do what you feel like doing, regardless of the consequences. And I just feel we cannot do that anymore.
So what does making that shift for yourself in a field that's not making that shift with you, like, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's kind of a tough one, because so I feel that the kind of milieu that we're in to some extent is quite relativistic, which is that, everything goes and we have to respect everybody, and you can't really say to somebody you're doing it wrong, basically. We're not in that space anymore. Part of the challenge that I see is that, in a context where everything is kind of relative, how do you have standards? How do you say, well, actually, that's not good enough? Greta was in Congress. She said, it's not good enough what you're doing. And that is an amazing statement to make. That is not a statement that is made very often these days, to say, well, actually, you might be trying really hard. You might be spending lots of money. It doesn't matter. It's not sufficient. It's not good enough for what is needed. It's quite a crazy thing to hear in some ways. So there's a challenge of, I guess, what I would kind of call reflexive practice, that we have to reflect really on our own practice and be really honest about our practice in order to kind of mature it. And I guess, with 10 in 10, in some ways, that's the invitation, which is that, if that is what you want to do, then we will fight for you and we will find resources for you and we will provide support for you. But that's really the crux of the invitation, which is that, it's not a blank slate. It's not whatever you feel like doing. There are certain things that we want to do. There's certain things we know how to do. But beyond that, it's reflexive. It's, we're exploring it together. We're figuring out, and ultimately we're trying it. And we're trying it in a way that has a degree of integrity, I think. And again, that's a tough kind of word, because you can't walk around basically saying, your practice doesn't have integrity and mine does, you can't really do that.
People do.
People do. But it's, on what basis,
Yeah.
And again, I think it's a tough time basically. And I think also, again, kind of going back to some of the things we've been talking about. So, I also think it's a tough time, because as a person of color, because as a woman, because as a young person, you're essentially taking on calling out people that are authorities or considered authorities in the system, and you're calling them out, and you're basically saying, actually, and typically it's like a white man, you don't know what you're doing, and that is not acceptable. You cannot make that call without there being consequences. And so part of me is a bit like, I have to make a choice, as somebody who's a practitioner, as someone who genuinely wants to see and figure out how to deal with these things. I'm a bit like, do I call it out? And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to call it out now. And, that's a tough decision to make, I think. And again, not to generalize, it's not a general case, but I think that there is a situation where we have what I would kind of call business as usual practices, and we're locked into those. And that's a dominant response to these things. And fundamentally, it doesn't work. And this is kind of my point, that it does not work. And you can see it does not work. And it is not working. Why are we doing it? And we're doing it because it's culture. We're doing it because there is a dominant system. We're doing it because doing those things rewards you. Doing these things doesn't reward you, so it's a bit like, well, unfortunately, that's the price we pay. But do we call it out? And do we basically say, sorry, no, not doing it?
Yeah, it's so interesting because we were talking before we actually pressed record more about our experiences with being people of color. And I honestly, for many years, didn't realize that was adding a whole load of extra intensity to anything that I was saying. And I didn't realize that when I just thought that I was pointing something out that could make a project go better, or a different perspective, a different way of seeing it, that I was upsetting so much of the status quo. That's been a bit of a journey to realize that is happening, and that happens when you are anyone that doesn't quite fit into that business as usual type of mentality, like where it just doesn't quite make sense to you and align with the way that you see the world. And like you said, we are at this place where there is a timeline now. I mean, there has been, we've known about it for a long time.
I have, yeah.
But that there is this timeline, and that's becoming more and more apparent with climate breakdown. And yeah, that balance of needing to call things out because we just don't really have time to waste in some of that. But then also the fallout that can happen, that then it ends up taking even more time to deal with and to process. And so I think it's a kind of interesting question of like, when do you call something out, and how can you do it in a way where it ends up not taking more of your energy away from the core work, which was the main point?
Yeah, one way of seeing it is that it is the core work, basically. That, and I don't mean the core work is dealing with distractions. And what I mean is that I think the dominant paradigm, practices, behaviors, all of these things, they're the causal drivers of what's kind of going on. And again, if those are the causal drivers, how do you respond to them? Do you collude with them? Do you call them out? Do you say, actually, this is not acceptable behavior? I think the question really that comes up for me, and perhaps this is kind of what you're saying, is just what do you do with the cost, basically? So when there is an implication, when there is a cost, when there is sort of like, well, we'd rather not have you in the room, however subtly that's kind of put, because you're actually...
And often not that subtly, in my experience.
No, and often not at all that subtly, but it's sort of like, what do you do? Do you abandon those spaces? Do you fight back? Do you push back? Do you accept it? Those are tough decisions to make. And I think that it's a big world. It is a big, big world. There are a lot of people out in the world. And I kind of think that there are probably enough people who are constitutionally incapable of consciously colluding with that to basically say, well, actually, we're not doing it anymore. And, it's a strong word to use, right? Collude. It's kind of a tough word to use. And I think, the thing I struggle with is the element of kind of judgment in this, which is like, again, like, I don't want to fall out on the side of actually being unreasonable or lacking empathy or all of these things. And I kind of think that's the trap, basically, which is that, you don't want to be a horrible person. You don't want to be a difficult person. You want to understand people. You want to connect with people. But in the process, how much are you actually colluding with stuff which is really, really not acceptable behavior and just not acceptable practice?
Yeah, that's the interesting part of it, because it's not really about wanting to call things out or even like a kind of moral judgment or superiority. But I think that all of us, no matter what colour skin we are, no matter what gender we identify with, no matter how much money we make, can feel that often we are asked to do things in a way to serve this system that does not feel right in the core of our being. And if we all just carry on doing those things whilst feeling a little bit internally awkward about it, that's not going to create the change or the shifts that we need into a different system.
Yeah, and I kind of think, that there's really valuable information in that internal awkwardness, in the sense that, why am I feeling this way? And also what is it telling me? But also, how do you honor it? So how do you honor that internal awkwardness, which is like, there isn't something not quite right here, but I am shutting up and I'm quiet about it and I accept it and it's my problem, not your problem. And I just think that there's just a lot of data that's kind of missing in a way, because we think it's kind of us. And just to be super clear, also I think through these kind of conversations and through these reflections, also kind of seen my role as a man, basically, and my kind of male privilege and how I take that for granted, right? And I basically, there's my collision, basically, where I'm a bit like, I'll play the man, I'll take that. I'll take the advantages and the privileges that I get from essentially kind of being a man in these kind of systems. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I also just think that, what does it mean to create systems and structures and organizations and communities that are friendly, if you like, to people of color, to women, to young people? What does that mean? And what does that look like? And what does it mean to not be in a system where you have constantly or frequently moments of awkwardness, of not fitting in and feeling that you've actually got this feeling that I'm feeling doesn't belong here, basically, and it's not welcome here. And it's a bit like, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to feel that myself, but I also don't want to recreate systems and structures and organizations where people constantly have to do that. And it's like, I don't know what it looks like, but all I know is that I'm not going to recreate existing structures and systems where multiple people feel that way. And it's like, why are we doing that? And we're doing it because we don't know how to do it, because it's unconscious. I don't know. But that also is partly kind of the impetus with 10 in 10, which is that, we've all got work to do. And it's like, okay, what does it mean to create a structure or a home or an organization or a community where those feelings of awkwardness have a place, basically, because they're valuable and they tell us something about what isn't working in the world.
Yeah, we have so many stories that limit our possibility. I was at a breakfast this morning, which was at a women's business club, about flexible working. It was kind of the theme of the breakfast. And I've been invited because I contributed the well-being material for their online academy. And it was just really interesting, this kind of idea of well, we'll get there in 10 years. And also, one woman saying, well, I'd love to offer flexible working, but this is a small team and I just need everyone there and we won't get things done. And you see how deeply ingrained all of these ideas of the system are.
Yeah.
And how much time everyone thinks we have, or not everyone, but the sense of how long it takes to create more space for something, and people kind of chipping into the conversation of yes, but we've got to also remember that we're human beings at least a couple of hours a day. And it's interesting for me when I go into those spaces, I feel a bit of a relief that I somehow freed myself from those scenarios, which has not been an easy ride at all, because I also feel that I lack the protection of the income, the holidays, the support, the being taken to places, not having to create everything for myself, getting paid sometimes to just be sociable, and all of these aspects of it. Yeah, I'm also wow, we create such intense cultural stories about how things have to be done, and how impossible it is to change them.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think that and I think on the other side, the flip side of that also is that the context that we're in demands change. It's so dramatically demanding change that I think there's a massive, massive, massive opportunity, in the sense that we don't know how to do these things. And it's not like the Germans have figured it out and we haven't, or the Indians have figured it out and we haven't, or, the Americans have figured it out. It's like nobody has figured it out, really. And that means that, there's an opportunity for the Somalis can be the best in the world at dealing with complex challenges, or, the South Africans or whoever, basically. And it's not the Germans and it's not, the Americans. And so I kind of think that there is this huge opportunity, enormous opportunity, to actually kind of go, well, what does it take? And do it. Let's do it. Let's basically figure it out. Let's have integrity around it. Let's be effective. But actually, you can recreate these structures and these cultural stories that everyone says, well, that's just the way it is. And it's like, no, that's not just the way it is. That is the way it is currently, but that is not the way it needs to be. And also, obviously, the way it currently is benefits certain people. It privileges certain people and essentially disenfranchises other people. And that's not the way it needs to be. And we have this huge opportunity, which is that there is this impetus to change that pretty much, I would say broadly people are aligned on. Yes, things need to change. And it's like, yeah, but we don't want to lose. But then it's the flip side of that is then, the people who are in positions of privilege don't want to lose that privilege. And actually what I feel is happening is that there is a furious rearguard action to protect privilege, basically, essentially not to lose privilege. And I'm a bit like, it doesn't matter what we do, you're going to lose that battle. That battle is over. So, the sooner you realize that battle is over, because, we're all going to lose it. It's not going to be just one group of people. It's like, you're on the end of the Titanic, which is up in the air, and you're kind of saying you're okay. And it's like, no, you're not okay. Nobody's okay. So I kind of think there is this also huge opportunity to realize where we are and kind of say, okay, what's the work now? What does it look like?
So can you take us a little bit deeper into the themes and questions that you're exploring through 10 in 10?
Yes, I mean, 10 in 10's the mission that we're talking about with 10 in 10 is how do we tackle 10 global challenges in 10 years? And really, the framework of 10 years is that, we have this window and we need to act within this window. And it's a extremely tight window. So it's like, we have 120 months. And suddenly you're like, well, months matter, days matter, hours matter. And, I'm not one to kind of privilege speed over everything else, but I kind of think there is this timetable, there is this, the science is basically giving us a time frame. So the first thing is that, we've got this window that we can act in. What are we going to do in that window? And how do we essentially shift some of these things, which if we don't shift within a 10-year time period, really will tip, if you like, into a different place. So that's kind of the first thing. And then I think the question that we're really asking is, the bet, if you like, is that we can be effective in that time frame and we can learn how to do things quickly if we provide the right support structures to people. And really kind of, if you like, the kind of crux and the core of what we're talking about is that the people that are impacted most by the challenges we're talking about must be part of, and want to be part of, and should be part of creating the solutions and creating the responses. And it's a bit like, it's not a consultation process. It's not like we're going to go talk to some single mums or going to talk to some farmers, but it actually saying, how do we genuinely create structures of power, and how do we genuinely share relationships of power with people that are impacted by these challenges so that they actually can help design responses to them. And really that's kind of the crux of the idea that there will be more and more and more people in the world that are impacted by these challenges. And it's like, what are they going to do? What should they be doing? And it's like, well, they should be working on coming up with responses to these challenges. So how do we do that? And how do we, genuinely put power into the hands of people that are being impacted? And again, like, I'm not positing kind of a utopian, let's empower the peasants kind of thing, but it's sort of like we have to partner, and different parts of society have to learn how to partner and genuinely work with each other if we're going to tackle these things. And our dominant structures and systems absolutely do not know how to do that. I mean, they work in silos, they work in ways where, people are disconnected from people on the ground. Expertise essentially has no skin in the game. There are no consequences for getting it wrong. So I kind of feel that, again, like the dominant systems are entirely unfit for purpose when it comes to that kind of work. So the 10 in 10 intention, if you like, is, how do we do that? How do we actually create system structures? How do we resource basically people on the ground who really are being impacted by these challenges?
Amazing. So I often feel that that's missing somehow in a lot of what's being done and shared.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to someone the other day and saying, you could, for $175,000 a year, you can hire a program officer at a foundation sitting in New York. Or you could hire 175 farmers in rural India to work on the challenges of rural agriculture. And it isn't to say that those farmers have solutions to these problems, but they know a hell of a lot more about it than a program officer sitting in New York. I mean, that is a fact. And also, I mean, they have skin in the game. They have immense incentive to try and deal with issues of crop failure and drought, all sorts of things. And it's like, what would it take to basically say, well, let's hire them full time for $175,000? $1,000 a year is like low end of like rural Indian income. And basically then say, well, what would we give them? What support structures would we give them? What resources would we give them? And basically, how would those people solve the problems that they're basically profoundly, deeply being impacted by? But like, why wouldn't you do that? Why would you not do that as an experiment? And why wouldn't you try and do that basically, rather than saying, actually, some professors are going to design an experiment or design a program, and these farmers are subject to those programs, basically. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. And I would say that that's bad science. It's like, that's not how complexity works. Complex systems do not work that way. You have to basically be involved. You have to essentially have skin in the game to come up with responses to them. Otherwise, you won't, basically. There are no consequences to failure in that case. And you'll just come up with what people do come up with, largely programs that don't work.
And programs that often are based in this sort of neo-colonial model of like, here's the answer. We've figured it out and we're bringing it to you.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And, I think the biggest risk of trying to do this work and trying to kind of professing to kind of want to change systems is you actually end up just recreating them. And you end up recreating structures of oppression, structures of colonialism, structures of neocolonialism, structures of privilege. And actually, you've just recreated them from scratch, basically. And it's a bit like, that's the risk. So how do we do it differently? And are we cognizant of the risk? And do we value that risk? Do we basically say, well, actually, we don't want to do that? Or do we kind of say, it's okay. It doesn't matter that much. If you are not one of these people on the ground being impacted by the challenge, then clearly it doesn't matter to you because, your pension is intact, your mortgage is intact, your life is intact, basically. If you mess up, what's going to happen, basically? Nothing really.
So it sounds amazing and also super challenging. And I'm curious as to how it's coming together.
Yeah. We've kind of gone through several iterations, if you like, of the work over the last kind of 2 decades, I guess. It hasn't kind of emerged from a vacuum or emerged from scratch. It's sort of, it's kind of been a slow, reflective process of iterating and moving things along. So we sort of soft launched about 2 months ago. And the idea was to test and see, okay, does anyone want to do this? Is this interesting to people? And the response has been amazing. And there've been lots of people have gotten in touch. Lots of people that I've never heard of have been getting in touch and saying, how do I help? And how do we help make this happen? We're basically focusing primarily on climate change at the moment. And obviously that contextually and in our current situation is quite high on the radar for a lot of people. It's coming together. It makes sense and it's kind of resonating with people. So clearly like the message has resonated with people and people are responding to it. I do think it's extremely tough and it's extremely challenging. And I do wake up kind of at least one day a week going, this is crazy. What are we doing? And I think that kind of self-doubt is obviously normal to some extent. Yeah, so I think it's tough. And I think that, I just kind of think that it's resonating and people are coming and saying, how do I help? And let's get on with it, and yeah.
And what are you saying to the people that are saying, how can I help? Because I imagine that many of our community listening will also want to help.
Yeah. So what's getting really clear in my mind is there are basically 3 pieces to the work. There's 3 elements to the work. So one element to the work is quite technical. So there's technically, is it possible to do these things? Is it possible to find, to address this challenge within the timescales that we need to address them in? And do the numbers kind of all add up? So there's kind of a technical component to the work. There's a political component to the work, which is, will it get funded? Will it get resourced? Will people provide support for it? Will donors step in? Will investors step in? And then the final one is the emotional case for the work, which is, why are we doing this? What is the imperative to do this work? And emotionally, why do we want to do this work? So basically, what I'm realizing is that in many cases, the technical case is kind of missing. So what does it mean to respond at scale to the climate crisis? So the question we're asking is, how do we reduce global emissions by 1 billion tons of CO2e? Now, 1 billion tons is all of Africa's emissions in a year or all of Germany's emissions in a year. So that's a huge amount. So the question is, technically, how do you do that? So we're making a technical case based on the last 20 years of work that we've done. And, people like Greta are making the emotional case out in the world. So our job is to make the political case that we have to say to people, these experiments, and there are experiments, have to be run. So it isn't a case of, let's do something that we know is going to work, because we don't have that. And there's a pretense that we do, that, we know what to do. And it's like, no, we don't know what to do. We do not know what will work. And that is the fundamental nature of complexity, that you cannot predict in advance what will work. You can try things out and see what happens. That's it, basically. And so you have to try things out. And so the case that we're making is that these experiments have to be run, and these experiments that have to have a degree of integrity around them. They have to have a degree of technical coherence where the numbers add up to a solution. And I kind of say that because I'm trying to think whether I should moderate this, but I would kind of say, 90 to 100% of strategies that I see proposed do not have technical coherence. The numbers do not add up. You can look at them on paper and they're going to fail. And it's a little bit like, me saying to you, okay, my goal is to feed 1,000 people. And then I write a strategy for it, and you read it and you kind of go, okay, but in your strategy, you're only going to feed 20. So how are you going to get to 1,000? And I basically say magic.
Well, I would just assume that you are Jesus reincarnated.
Right. So it's like, we're going to say a prayer, we're going to do some magic. And, and the words in our current kind of, the words for those are things like scaling up. We're going to scale up. We're going to pilot. We're going to do this. And so there's a whole set of language which actually makes no sense. And it's a bit like, what exactly do you mean by that? Practically, what does that mean? And it's like, well, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. It's like, that makes no sense whatsoever.
No, but it's what investors are used to hearing. And it's kind of this language that's been created to kind of make it seem like we know what we're doing.
Right. And part of that language is a response to uncertainty and risk, basically, because we're dealing with problems that are so vast and difficult and challenging. Investors and donors and people who are making these investments, they want to know, well, how do we know it's going to work? And this is the thing which fundamentally misunderstands the nature of risk, which is that you don't know it's going to work. Just because someone pretends that you know it's going to work doesn't mean it's true. And you either embrace the risk and you basically say, okay, we're working with complexity, and that means it's complex. And that means that it's a high risk endeavor, and we are going to risk capital and we're going to risk resources. And that's what we're going to do. That's a decision that we're making rather than trying to minimize risk. So what tends to happen is that institutions try to minimize risk to themselves, and in doing so, they maximize risk to the system, which is these problems are not getting solved because we're trying to minimize risk to our own institutions. And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense.
And how designed are we for risk? Because, one of the things that I've noticed even in myself, like when I talk to someone that really feels like they know what's happening in the future and they've got a plan, like I feel myself being like, okay, I'm going to just stand closer to this person for the apocalypse because like they know what's happening. And then I catch myself and I laugh and I'm like, oh, I just got kind of, I just felt safe by their certainty. And of course, that's what's happening with some of the politics that we have in the world right now, with this kind of rise of fascism, that there's a feeling of safety and a path forward. And it's very natural, I think, as a response as a human.
Yeah.
And so how do we, as humans, accept this complexity and uncertainty and be able to prepare ourselves and be more courageous for risk?
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, there's only two places to intervene, dealing with any kind of issue. There's inside, so inside your head, and there's outside. So, you can re-engineer systems and you can build green buildings or whatever it is, or you can basically shift your own reactions and responses and behaviors to things. So you could think about, to put it really crudely, education is a way of kind of shifting what's kind of going on inside your head. And, building green buildings or re-engineering infrastructure is a way of doing it externally. And as you say, we're not very good at dealing with risk, which is completely human and understandable. But there's the challenge, right? That actually the problems are not outside. The problems are not like, oh, look, there's a community over there that basically doesn't have water or food or suffers from gun violence or racism or whatever, or poverty. And we need to go fix those people over there. The problem is inside, basically. The problem is essentially our own reactions to uncertainty, to risk, to not knowing. So how do we put in place strategies that really are fit for purpose? So these strategies I talk about that, 90 to 100% of them don't work. They provide us with a degree of certainty because, we wrote it down. It's on paper, so it must be true, right? And it's a bit like, that's not strategy. I mean, that is a piece of paper. That's not strategy. So then it's like, what is strategy? And it's like, well, strategy is a mess, basically. It's the world. It's operating in 3 dimensions. It's operating with things that don't fit into Microsoft products. It's dealing with emotions. It's dealing with conflict. It's dealing with people who don't want to share how they feel. How do we build the skills and capabilities to deal with these things, right? Because they're real. They're 3-dimensional problems. So we're trained in some ways to deal with 2-dimensional problems, which is, how do I create a PowerPoint deck or a presentation, or how do I put the numbers together? We're good at those things because we don't have to deal with all the things you're saying, which is we don't have to deal with risk and uncertainty inside ourselves. We have a degree of certainty. It's like, it's on paper. So I kind of think that's the work, right? It's exactly what you're saying, that, The work is, how do we deal with the fact that we are in a context and in situations that are deeply risky, deeply complex, deeply uncertain, basically. And yet we have to act in those contexts, and we have to act confidently. We have to act with confidence that we don't know. But again, the confidence comes from basically seeing. And it's like, well, let's try it and let's see what happens, but let's have confidence that we can redesign it, we can redo it, we can learn from it, we can kind of move forward. And I think we lack that confidence, that we're seeking certainties in the wrong things, basically. And it's like, I say to people, well, is a plan certain or is your team certain? Like, where do you want to find certainty? Do you want to find certainty in a planning document? Or do you actually want to trust your team and basically say, well, actually, let's invest in my team and let's build this team up and let's trust this team of people to come up with something, rather than say, well, actually, they're a footnote, Appendix 6 in the proposal, and I'm going to invest all my energy in a piece of paper, basically. And it's like, why would we do that? Because that piece of paper cannot change with the context, and it cannot respond to what's happening in the world, basically. So it's where do you want to put your faith, basically? And without doing that inner work of dealing with, uncertainty and dealing with things that we are not in evolutionary terms adapted to deal with, it's like, it's not going to work, basically, unfortunately.
What motivates you to get out of bed and explore these questions?
I mean, I kind of think it's two things. One is that it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the opportunity that, I had this moment, I think, probably around 2006, where I was a bit like, oh my God, we don't know what we're doing. Sort of like disillusionment of like, I thought we knew what we were doing, and I thought we could learn how to do it. It's just like a degree of kind of disillusionment. And I came out of that through the realization that we might not know how to do it, but we have the seeds of solutions. We have the seeds of practice. We have the seeds of things that do work. And it's a bit like, well, are we going to abandon those seeds, or are we going to grow those seeds? Are we going to water them? Or are we going to basically say, it's too hard, it's too difficult? And so I think the two things that motivate me, one is seeing that there's a huge opportunity here and a huge possibility for us to really shift quite dramatically some of these systems that are deeply dysfunctional and, literally generating trauma and ecological destruction as their byproducts. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it, honestly, is like, I'm just pissed off. I'm just like, what the hell? What are we doing? And I'm annoyed, I'm angry, and I'm just like, this is not good enough. And, I'm not willing to accept it, and I'm not willing to collude with it, and I'm not willing to say this is good enough, It's not good enough. And I think that, yeah, it's those two things, I think.
Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty. And 20 years ago, when you could have become a management consultant or whatever else took your fancy, can you remember what the spark was that brought you into this work?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, I mean, my family background is, if you like, a couple of generations of diaspora, a couple of generations of refugees, basically. So, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, 47 was partition, 1971 was, civil war in Bangladesh. And in 1984, I was in Delhi when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and we kind of saw what happened there. In 92, the Gulf War happened. So these incidents in my life and my parents' life and kind of my grandparents' life have always kind of been there. And I think that they've always been present in my consciousness without me being aware of what they mean or what they are. Increasingly, they've played a more important part in my work, in the sense that, that's kind of who I am and that's kind of where I've come from. And I can kind of see even further back than that, it's exactly the kind of same history. So, going back to probably even the 1800s and kind of beyond. So what's happened over the last 20 years has been an awareness of who I am to some extent, and an awareness that actually that's where I come from, that's my background. These are the things that I've experienced, these are the things I've seen. These aren't the things that I want my kids to see, and these aren't the things I want other people's kids to see. And yeah, just there's something to be learned there, basically. I don't think there was ever a question of me becoming a management consultant. I think, the path was kind of there always. It was more a matter of me discerning the path and kind of going. For me, it's always been, the next step has always been clear, even though I have resisted it. So, it's a bit like, I really don't want to do this. And, I'd like an easier path, but there isn't really an easier path. And I could pick one, but I would just be suspending a part of my identity, part of who I am, basically, which isn't going to work. I know it's not going to work. So in some ways, it's kind of clear. It's like,
yeah, no, I get it. When I have tried to pick an easier path, it's actually not been very easy. It's been painful.
Yeah.
And the paths that I've ended up on have not been easy, but they felt more natural, even with all their challenges. And I felt more alive and connected to myself.
Yeah, I mean, I've started just thinking about it as in my old age, I'm sort of constitutionally incapable now. I kind of say I can't basically go and be a management consultant. I can't go and pretend to be something that I'm kind of not, even though, maybe materially it would be kind of easier, or that, you wouldn't be struggling in the same kind of way. But yeah, it's kind of a fantasy, right? It's like, it's not real. It's like, I'm going to go off and, be whatever. Yeah, so obviously that resonates and that makes sense. Yeah.
And you have a twin sister.
I do, yeah.
How has that affected your view of yourself and the world?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I have a son, and, I have one son, so he's kind of a single boy, if you like, and not, he doesn't have lots of siblings. And so what I've kind of realized right now is that she was always with me. So, like wherever we went and moved, there was another person with me. And I think that probably had quite a profound impact. So, we moved when I was 7 from South London to Bombay, and then we moved from Bombay to Delhi, and then we moved from Delhi to the Middle East. And what I realized is that those transitions were relatively easy in some ways. I don't remember them as being traumatic transitions particularly. And I suspect it's partly because of her and having siblings, basically, that, you traveled as a little pack, basically, and as a unit. And, with her, she was obviously in the same class as me until probably we were about 16, maybe a bit earlier, 13, 14, maybe. But, sort of like for a significant formative part of my life, it was like there was always someone with me. That's interesting. When I kind of look at my son, I'm like, what would happen if we moved to India tomorrow? What would happen if we moved here tomorrow? It would kind of be tough in some ways, I guess.
Is she doing similar kind of work?
She's civil servant, so she's deep in the guts of Brexit at the moment and trying to grapple with that. So I don't envy her job.
Yeah, well, thank you.
I know.
For taking that on.
I know, seriously. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why I asked that. I think I'm curious about, I guess, that kind of masculine and feminine, and getting to kind of be so physically aligned through all those formative years.
Yeah.
And in the womb.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Asian families is all right. It's like they're very gendered. And yeah, it's been interesting growing up with, so I have a younger sister who's 5 years younger than me. And my mum, sort of a lot of very kind of strong female role models. And, it's just been present kind of throughout my life. And to a large extent kind of unconscious to some extent, that, only realizing it now when I start talking about things like male privilege and, gender and race issues and religion and so on. My sisters, my mum being present, and my experience of them has really informed, I think, a lot of, just informed my worldview quite a lot.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting just getting a sense of what kind of family backgrounds and younger experiences that we have, and also the identities we have to carry, how that ends up making us more or less open to change and to new perspectives and new dynamics and understanding privilege. It seems that there are certain factors that just make that a lot easier. And so that also makes me kind of understand why for some people it is very hard to see things from a different perspective and to let go of systems that feel outdated. Because if you've not had to live in your family through these big kind of generational shifts and uprootings and identities, that must make it very, very difficult.
Yeah, the challenge in some ways is to figure out how all of those perspectives and stories and have a place. So what is the place, if you like? And I think the challenge I have with, again, the dominant system, whatever you want to call it, the dominant paradigm, is that there are certain experiences and certain people that don't have a place. It's sort of like, in order to succeed in this system, you have to give up who you are to some extent. And I think that's the tragedy, and I think that's the challenge, which is that, isn't to say that white men over 50 don't have a place in the system, or that, white people should be this or should be that, but it's sort of like, it's a question of relationship, which is, where are you in relationship to other people? Who are you stopping, if you like, going back to kind of our earlier conversation? Who does your privilege actually exclude from the room? Literally, like, your privilege means these people cannot be in the room with you because of your discomfort. And I think that's unacceptable. And it's like, find your place, basically. Find your place in relationship to other people. And that's what it's about, basically, rather than excluding people. And, it's like, I was joking about this in a workshop, but it's sort of like, if you want to defend white culture, do that. If that's who you are, but recognize that it comes with a genealogy and a legacy, which in some ways is quite horrible and brutal. But, like, that's okay. If your grandfather was a Nazi, that doesn't mean you're a Nazi. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that's not what it means, right? But there is a place for it. There's a place for white culture, which is not normative, which is not universal. And it does not mean that everyone has to fit in with those normative standards. And it's like, if you accept that, then defend it. And I'll help you defend it. But, I'm not going to help you universalize it and normalize it so that everyone has to be like you. And that if they're not like you, you're so uncomfortable that you can't cope with it. It's just like, no, not going to do that. So I do think there's something about, like, what's our place, basically. And on the assumption there's a place for everybody, and that everyone has a contribution to make, and a creative contribution to make, and a constructive contribution to make, and that everyone's genealogy is part of our lineage, basically. That, it is part of history. It's part of our history, basically. So I guess that, for me, is the question, which is, are we able to take our place? Am I able to take my place as a man, basically? What is my place as a man, basically? And I can't operate in the assumption, well, it must be at the top, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. So I'm like, what is it, and how do I find it, basically?
And part of it is that awareness of the power dynamics that are always there in every relationship, in every room, in every business, in every project, and being brave enough to find ways to name it, to shift it, to open up space. And I think recognizing that can be quite a clumsy experience.
Totally.
and it's easy to get it a bit wrong.
Yeah, but I think the alternative of, ossifying those power dynamics and institutionalizing them and fossilizing them so that they are permanent is not an antidote to discomfort and clumsiness. And it's like, you can't do that. I mean, you'll do it, but it's not acceptable. And it's like, as long as these power dynamics are fluid and they're shifting, then they're okay. They're healthy in some ways. It's like, you can be in charge on Monday and someone else can be in charge on Tuesday. And depending on the context and the task and the situation, those power dynamics will shift. And I think the problems come where you kind of institutionalize them, lock them down, and they become part of essentially culture, where again, you cannot violate those cultural norms and those rules. That is when they start becoming problematic.
We have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
In so many areas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel really optimistic and I feel where we're pushing through in so many different ways. And then maybe today I've been at many meetings in the kind of in London, going to different spaces and engaging with different kind of parts of the system. And then I like, oh, wow, like that's where we are. And then, of course, I spend a lot of time in this kind of bubble of amazing people that are really creating something different and operating in a whole different way. And yeah, I think sometimes I find it hard to hold that paradox of feeling where we're really opening and developing and being in rooms with people that I've been in rooms with like 10, 15 years ago and seen how uptight they are about certain things, and then being in rooms with them where they're naming and opening it and mentioning things, and a lot more conversation around race is happening.
Yeah.
Even just this past weekend, I was with some people and there was this network that I really wanted to be part of like 10 years ago, and I felt like everyone that was doing similar work to me was part of this network, and it felt quite traumatic actually to not be in it, because I felt like that would have given me the freelance opportunities and the camaraderie and the extra kind of support. I was with the founder of this network, and he didn't actually know each other because it had regional like hubs to it, and he was based in the States, and so there was the London hub that had said no, and we were talking about it, and he was joking and saying, I'll cover your therapy costs for the trauma that you've been through from being excluded. And then openly said it's probably because of race. And actually that there was a woman in that network that was a woman of colour that was actively blocking other people of colour to join the network. And for me, that's super refreshing to be able to have a conversation about this thing that happened years ago, but had caused some serious, discomfort and pain for me.
Yeah.
And then having a white man say, yeah, it's actually just probably because of your race that you didn't get in. Yeah. And then that showed up in different ways. And this is the story that was created of why that you didn't become part of that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was great because we were laughing about it. And, and he said, if you ever just need to get triggered really deep, just call me and I'll exclude you from something. And we were kind of making jokes about it, but it felt like really like, wow, this conversation would not have been possible at the time, 5-10 years ago. Yeah. And so that is really something. Yeah. And then.
Yeah. No, I totally hear you. And I kind of think, I agree with you. I also just think that, we have to ask ourselves where our standards come from. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it's a bit like, and I asked myself this, I mean, what is it that's good enough? And where does it come from? Where does my sense of what's good enough come from? My sense of, where does my sense of optimism come from? Where does my sense that actually we're doing sufficient or not sufficient or whatever it is, where does it kind of come from? And I kind of think it's interesting because obviously these standards are inner standards, right? Like they're internal to us. We get them from somewhere or they develop somehow. But I do wonder kind of where we get them from. And I had this really funny experience I was in Paris with Manish a couple of weeks ago. And so
with Manish Jain, who many of you know from the show.
Yeah, and there was a colleague of a friend of ours there from South India, a guy called Jalil, and they were working on drug discovery, so they're working on open source pharma, basically. Anyway, so he kind of made this like throwaway comment. The throwaway comment was something like, here's a paper that I published and we did some drug discovery work. And the throwaway comment was, we did it in a hut in my village. And I was a bit like, sorry, wait, stop. What did you just say? And so it turned out, basically, he had a bunch of time and he went back to his village in South India and they basically did basic science research and they got laptops and they managed to hook them up to a supercomputer network at one of the big research centers. And they published scientific papers from their hut. And I was a bit like, you did what? And, this was completely matter of fact. It was like, yeah, then we did this, and we did this, and we had, this, and we had this group of people, and we just did this. And it just completely blew my mind. It was like, I didn't even know that was possible. And you just did it. And he was like, yep, we just did it. And what? And I was a bit like, where do my standards for what it takes to do basic research come from? Well, not from him, clearly. Right. And he just did it. And they just did it. And they published these papers, in peer-reviewed journals. So I kind of feel like we also need to go look in other places. We need to go other places and look at other places. And we need to ask ourselves, the standards that we're holding, where are they from? And are they good enough? And actually, there are other standards, that we could aspire to at least, right? But yeah, and that's kind of an open question, that how do we develop them and how do we advance them and how do we move them? And, and then suddenly you come across something like that and you're just a bit like, whoa.
The unlearning of how we do things.
Yeah, but also the unlearning of what we accept.
Yeah.
It's like, we accept it. And, I'm speaking for myself, right? It's like, yeah, accept loads of things over the last 20 years where I'm a bit like, that's just how it is. And that's the standard, right? It's like, that's good enough. And then I'm a bit like, is it? And I'm asking the question. I'm not saying, that I have the answer to it, but it's sort of like, it's an interesting question. How far have we come with race relations? How far have we come with this? Or how far have we come with even just the paradigm of doing science? It's like, that's good. Is that good enough? And could we be doing a lot better? I mean, why can we not have 100 million Indians in villages in South India doing basic research? Why not? Why can we not have, 100 million farmers across the world doing agricultural innovation? I mean, why? We can, but it's essentially the standards that we set ourselves and we're getting them from somewhere. And I'm a bit like, where are they coming from?
And that's so interesting for all of us, even if we just think about the things that we're doing in our own life and how or why we think that that's how we are meant to be doing it. It's a lot of that should thing. Well, it should be this way. And that's how I saw it modeled. And so then what I aspired to. And then when we recognize that the models that we have are not serving the future.
Or even the present.
Right.
Yeah.
And are not serving the values that are the most core to our being, then yeah, it really opens up a lot of redesigning.
Yeah, completely. I mean, the exciting part of that is that there's lots of people around, just, in the world that could be doing work that is creative and interesting and contributing towards addressing these kind of challenges. And it's like, a lot of those people are not, because of the dominant structures and the dominant systems. But it's like, it would be super interesting to see what, if you genuinely gave the resources to 5,000 rural farmers in India and said, innovate and crack these problems, who have huge incentive to do that, right? And it's like, yeah, give them $100 million and figure out ways of actually supporting them to do it. And it's like, what would happen, basically? And I kind of think that that's the risk aversion that we actually need to deal with, which is actually maybe just say yes, and see what happens, and like try it out and actually have some faith in people. And actually, that's super interesting and super exciting for me, that actually these possibilities exist and people exist who want to do this stuff, and we can work with them and we can create things that we've never even imagined, basically. And it's like, that's pretty cool. We could do that, but it requires letting go of the status quo. It requires letting go of existing structures of, privilege and business as usual and so on. And it's like, if we're not going to let go of those things, then we cannot do these things. So what's it going to be, basically?
And so we land at 10 and 10.
Right.
And I'm curious, is the idea that there is a different challenge every year, or that they kind of roll into each other and interplay with each other?
Yeah.
And I imagine it's also just open for it to shift a lot because you're trying things.
Yep. Yeah, so I think it wouldn't be a different challenge every year, but what we would like to do is demonstrate how to work on these challenges in general. So, let's take the issue of climate change and figure out what a response looks like that is at scale that other people can do. And I don't mean replicate. What I mean is like, let's set a standard for what's possible and raise the bar for what's possible. Doing that with the different challenges that we're talking about also kind of allows people entry points into the spaces or issues or domains that they have particular interest in, is one thing. So in some ways it's quite tactical. It's like, let's pick these 10 ways as entry points for people. But I would say, practically, if you're doing the work on the ground and you're working on, let's say, climate change in India, you almost likely are going to be working on gender issues and race issues and equity issues and poverty issues, agricultural issues, and so on. So in those teams that we support, so the idea is for each challenge we would set up a fund, and that fund would support multiple teams. So, let's say 10 teams working on women's economic empowerment, or 10 teams working on climate change. In those teams, I think you would see complexity kind of come alive, which is that these old boundaries, if you like, between kind of sectors or between kind of themes are actually, they're not three-dimensional. They're not real, basically. They're epistemological. They're on paper. But, if you're working on climate change, you can't be working on women's issues if you're working on climate change. I mean, that distinction is kind of meaningless, right? So it's like, why do we have these thematic distinctions? Because they're distinctions of an old paradigm to some extent. So how does that live in teams, basically, and in people doing real work on the ground? So my sense is, again, that we have to work with the dominant system. We have to work with it and figure out how to evolve it. And currently, the way the dominant system understands challenges is through very, in some ways, quite siloed, if you like, themes, right? But we have to evolve away from those.
So moving beyond the silos into the interbeing and the interconnection of these challenges. And therefore, as you're focusing on one or two, they're all lifting and moving together.
And I think, again, it's sort of like, you can choose to see them as separate. So, you can click on the climate change hashtag and see all the teams working on climate change, but you'll find that actually those teams are working on multiple issues at the same time. So I think part of it is also evolving our view on how we see kind of these different issues, basically, that we see them separated and siloed. And that's not real. That's kind of, a convenience that we've inherited from the academy and so on. So part of it, I think, is that we're not, we can't see that very clearly because we're not trained to see it clearly. But again, for people on the ground, it's a completely different experience. It doesn't fit cleanly into these 10 categories or 10 challenges or whatever it is. So yeah, I would just see them as entry points. It's like, where do you want to enter? And where do you want to start the work? It doesn't mean that's where you're going to end.
And if you are a brown woman who is about to lose her home due to a climate disaster, you can't tell that woman that these are separate issues because they are very much one.
No, absolutely. I mean, you can't basically say, sorry, you don't fit into the housing category because you're a climate refugee. I mean, do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a ludicrous thing to say. Again, going back to why I said earlier that, the crux of what we're trying to do is figure out how those people are able to come up with responses to those challenges, which is that, if you have lost your home and you are a climate refugee and you're female and you're non-white, you have a particular view and experience and quote expertise on that challenge that nobody else will have. Like nobody studying that problem from the outside is going to have the lived experience of it. But it's like, how does that resource and that lived experience become a resource as in terms of a vacation? It's like you can actually help other people not go through what you've gone through because you know something about it. And it's like, how do we do that? How do we actually make that a resource rather than actually be like, actually, you're just going to be a climate refugee living in a camp and you're going to be there for the next 20 years and your kids are going to be there and your grandkids are going to be there. And that is it, basically. And that's the best you can hope for.
You're going to be a victim.
Yeah.
And
you're going to be a victim of history and you're going to be a historical victim. And it's like...
And you're not going to get given the opportunity to share the wisdom in that experience.
It's almost like it's not that you're not given the opportunity. It's almost like you are deliberately constrained from it. Do you know what I mean? It's like we will put you in structures and conditions that will stop you from sharing your experience and your wisdom actively. Not that, it's like, hey, give me an opportunity. It's like, no, you have the opportunity. It's like, we're going to take it away from you. That's a whole different level of messed up. It's like, okay, where are we heading in the next 10 years? That's where we're heading, basically. And it's like, no, there's a better way. There's a better way of that individual contributing and that individual wanting to contribute and kind of going, well, actually, that's your right to some extent. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely does. And I feel like that example really lands actually what we're talking about, because there's so much of the global wisdom of this time just being pushed into these camps and silenced and hidden.
Yeah, and it's kind of fear, right? It's like we're afraid of people who are different. We're afraid of resource strains. We're afraid of whatever it is. We're afraid of the other, strangers, foreigners. And I think, that's the fight, basically. That's it. It's like, what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of country do you want to live in? What do you want, basically? And that's the choice. And it's like, make the choice.
Make the choice. Can you leave us with the 10 challenges, as we haven't actually named them?
Yeah, the best thing probably to do is just go to the website, which is 10 in 10. So it's xinx.co, and we've kind of listed them there. One thing maybe I would just say about them is that we've picked 10 challenges that are actionable. So the idea with the challenges is that these are challenges. So for example, climate change or mental health, for example. These are challenges that you can take action on. And what we haven't done is pick challenges that are existential. So we're not talking about world peace, for example, which obviously we want, but that's not a challenge that in some ways is actionable. We're not going to invite people to work on world peace, but we will invite people to work on climate change or preventing mental health issues or the challenge of artificial intelligence, how we govern that and how we deal with that. So we've picked challenges that are practical and actionable, and challenges that we can invite people to do real work on, basically.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for doing this work and laying out this invitation to everyone to join you and to lend whatever they can in order to make this possible.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I would just say that I feel that I'm part of a much broader community, and a lot of that community is invisible. And I think part of the work also is to make that invisible community more visible. And that's kind of what you've been doing with all of these podcasts, which is actually trying to make a lot of this work visible. So thank you for doing that.
to an extent, and I'm also aware how I'm falling into all the same traps of privilege and giving visibility to the somewhat visible,
Right.
you know, and
Right.
and that's something that I want to go deeper with. And of course, language is a barrier, but still finding the people that don't normally do the talking as well. And maybe we can work together more on that, of bringing some people and giving them the space to share with us that I might not know about. I would really love that. But yeah, thank you for your time this evening. And I feel like, yeah, it's been like a long time coming, this conversation.
Decades. Decades in the making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm on a personal level, I feel intrigued to see how this like lands in my own system and what I wake up to tomorrow, like that's more open and possible.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And maybe kind of one last thing to kind of build on what you said. So I honestly think it's kind of like, it's wide open. I don't think the windows have closed, so to speak, in terms of what's possible. I think it's completely wide open, and it is kind of ours for the taking at the moment. You know, that's also what kind of gets me moving, which is that actually it's open. It's super challenging, it's super hard, but it's possible and it's entirely feasible. We have all the pieces that we need. You know, we have the skills, we have the resources, we have the ideas, you know, we have pretty much everything we need.
Yeah. And like you said, when you work globally and in a way that's not colonial, but more like, I'm just so inspired when I just find out about all these amazingly cool projects and ways of thinking and solutions that are coming from all over the world, where people are less affected by this sort of dominant set of rules on how to do things.
Yeah.
And I think the more of that we can all open in ourselves, as Manisha would say, the unlearning and the allowing people that we wouldn't normally give authority to because of the systems and the structures to have the authority and the wisdom, and for us to be like, oh, cool, like let's see what's happening over here, and that openness. And then, like you said, when you open to that, it really is all wide open. We don't have to go in this direction that the media tells us that we're going in, or that the politics seems to point to, or any of this, because that's just one narrative, and there are so many at play in the world right now.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. The trust piece, right? Trust people. Like, trust people and see what happens. You know, because obviously a lot of these systems don't trust people, and we see what happens. We can see what's happening. So it's a bit like, well, what does it mean to trust people? And again, it's like, that's a colonial legacy, right? It's like, don't trust people to solve their own problems because they can't. And it's like, still alive and well in some ways. It's like, well, what happens if we trust people? And what happens if we give people resources and money and support? And do we trust them? Or do we fundamentally, we don't? You know, it's a class thing, it's a race thing, it's whatever. Can't trust those people. And that mindset, I feel, is like, that's the mindset, that's the question. It's like, again, it's wide open, but do you trust people?
And who do you trust?
And who do you put your faith in?
Thank you.
Not at all. Thanks for having me over. Yeah, keep talking.
Absolutely. And we'll post links to everything that's been mentioned.
Great. You know, and maybe one of the things is that people should get in touch. Yeah, let us know what you think, and how we can support, and, you know, how people can help, and so on.
Yeah, well, what I'm learning about this community, which being a podcast, it's somewhat invisible, but those that are making themselves visible is that, yeah, I think you'll hear from them.
Good.
Brilliant.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?